Gideon Blackwood had been 36 years upon this earth, and most of them had carved deeper lines in him than his age allowed. A widower's weight rested on his broad shoulders, with no children to carry his name and no partner to share the hearth. His cabin was his only companion, its logs darkened by years of storms and seasons. At night, he sat by the fire alone, the chair across from him as empty as the other half of his bed. Those in the nearby town spoke of his size before they spoke of his nature. Giant Blackwood, they called him, strong as an ox, with hands like hammers. But the truth of him lived not in his strength, but in his silence. He did not frequent the saloon or court the laughter of neighbors. He kept his words few and his world smaller still. That evening, the air pressed close, heavy with the smell of pine and imminent snow, when a sound broke against the cabin door. It was not the wind, nor the rattle of branches. It was a knock, sharp, hurried, and trembling. Gideon paused with a log in his arms, his head lifting, every instinct sharpening. No one came to his door after dark, not in winter, not without reason. He set the log down and moved to the door, pulling it open with a cautious hand. There she stood, small as a bird and just as fragile. A Chinese girl, no more than 7. Her hair, as dark as polished jet, was tangled and damp with snow. Her cheeks were blotched red with cold, and she wore only a thin tunic, torn at the hem. Her eyes were wide, not from the cold, but from a fear that had settled deeper than the frost. She looked up at him, a giant shadow in the doorway, and whispered words that hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. "They beaten my mamma. She is dying." Gideon felt the words strike the silence of his cabin, echoing in places he thought long closed. For a moment, he did not move. The girl's lips trembled, but she did not cry. She stood with a desperate dignity that no child should know. "Who is your mamma, child?" Gideon asked at last, his voice a low rumble. She swallowed hard. "My Lynn. They left her at the old shack by Miller's Creek. She can't get up. Please, sir, please help her." The name meant little to him, but he'd seen the woman in town. A Chinese woman of soft features, dulled by weariness, her eyes always downcast when her husband was near. Clay Garrett was his name, a man quick with drink and quicker with his fists. Gideon had seen him once, barking at her in the general store, his hand raised too close to her face as she wilted. Gideon had turned away, as most men did, subscribing to the old Western code. Another man's home was not yours to trespass upon, especially when that home belonged to a foreigner few understood or cared for. Yet hearing her name now from the lips of her child pierced him deeper than any winter wind. He crouched low, the porch boards creaking, so his height would not frighten the girl. "What's your name, little one?" "Unli," she whispered. Gideon saw the bruises on her small arms, the way she clutched the torn sleeve of her tunic. Something hardened in him, not a loud, burning anger, but a quiet fury that ran deep, like fire in the roots of a tree. "Get inside," he told her, standing tall again. The girl hesitated, but when the wind gusted, she stepped past him into the warmth. Gideon pulled on his heavy coat and strode into the night. Miller's Creek lay a mile off through bare cottonwoods. He carried no lantern, trusting the pale moon and his memory of the land. The shack came into view, a sagging ruin. He pushed the door open, the wood groaning. Inside, in the corner upon a pallet of rags, lay my Lynn. Her cheek was swollen and purple, one eye nearly closed. Her arm showed the marks of rough handling, her wrists raw. Yet her gaze, when it lifted to him, was not pleading. It was proud and steady, as though she would rather die on the floor than beg for mercy. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "They will say things." He knelt slowly and looked into her bruised face. "Let them say," he murmured. He slid his arms beneath her with a tenderness that belied his size, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. She closed her eyes, perhaps from shame, perhaps from the strange safety she felt in his grasp. At the cabin, Unli ran to the door. When she saw her mother in Gideon's arms, her face lit with a relief that made her seem years older and younger all at once. He carried my Lynn inside and laid her gently upon his own bed. Unlee climbed onto the bed beside her mother, tucking herself close. Gideon moved to the hearth, stoking the fire. He fetched water and cloth and, with rough but careful hands, began to clean My Lin's wounds. She winced but never cried out. He worked in silence, but each gesture said what his lips did not: "You are safe here. No hand will strike you again." Outside, snow fell heavier, blanketing the prairie. Within the cabin, a fragile warmth took root. But peace was a fleeting thing. Already in the tavern, Clay Garrett's voice carried loud and bitter. He told anyone who would listen that his woman had run off, that the giant Blackwood had taken her. He spat Gideon's name with venom, vowing to reclaim what was his. Men muttered and nodded, eager for a story to tell through the long winter nights, especially one involving the quiet giant and the Chinese woman. Back at the cabin, Gideon stood by the fire, looking down at the sleeping mother and child. Something stirred in him he had not felt in years, not desire, but the raw pulse of responsibility. He stepped to the window, pulling back the curtain. The prairie stretched dark and endless. He knew Clay was out there, sharpening his anger. Gideon's jaw tightened. He had made his choice the moment he lifted My Lin from the dirt floor. Whatever came now, he would not let her fall again. In the days that followed, the rhythm of Gideon's life shifted. He was no longer tending only to his ranch, but to two fragile souls. My Lin lay in his bed, her bruises mottling into hues of yellow and green. She woke to the smell of broth and cornmeal, simple food Gideon prepared with clumsy hands. She would murmur her thanks, and he would nod once, returning to his place by the hearth, as if fearing his presence might overwhelm her. Unlee, ever watchful, clung to her mother, but slowly her eyes began to wander toward Gideon. She watched the way his giant hand split wood, the way his shoulders seemed broad enough to shield the cabin from the storm. A quiet trust began to form, unspoken but lived in the way she dared to smile when he offered her a small, carved wooden horse he'd whittled in the evening silence. She held it tight as though it were gold. My Lin noticed these small things. Shame pressed heavy upon her. To be in another man's home, especially a white man's, meant vicious whispers would be born in town. She knew the way of gossip, made sharper by her race. Women muttering of her husband's temper would now shape new words: fallen woman, heathen, shameless. Gideon felt the weight, too. Each time he rode into town for supplies, eyes followed him. Men in the saloon spoke low, their glances sliding like knives across his back. He said nothing, letting his silence armor him. Yet when he returned to the cabin, the air seemed softer, filled with Aneli's quiet play or My Lin's soft hum as she stirred broth. These sounds carved through his solitude in ways no gossip could undo. One morning, the church bell tolled. Gideon hitched his wagon, deciding the child deserved the warmth of prayer and the woman deserved to feel the world again, even if it judged her. My Lin resisted. "They will stare," she whispered. Gideon met her gaze, his dark eyes steady. "Let them." Inside the small church, conversations faltered as Gideon led My Lin to a pew. After the service, Mrs. Agatha Finch, a woman with a tongue as sharp as a needle, cornered My Lin. "My dear," she said with a smile too sweet to be kind. "It must be hard, but perhaps it would be more fitting if you sought shelter with your own people. It isn't proper, a woman of your kind in an unmarried man's home. Folks are talking." Before My Lin could falter, Gideon's shadow fell across them. His gaze was heavy upon Agatha. Without a word, he stepped closer, his silence more potent than any rebuke. The woman's smile withered, and she scurried off. That night, My Lin sat by the fire, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I have brought ruin upon you." Gideon looked up from his carving. "It isn't forgiveness I'm after. It's peace." Her breath caught. No one had spoken to her that way in years, not as property, but as someone worthy of peace. Days folded into one another. My Lin regained her strength, rising to sweep the floor and mend Gideon's worn shirts with careful stitches. Her presence began to fill the cabin not as a burden, but as life. But the outside world grew sharper. In the saloon, Clay Garrett's fury festered. He drank deep, promising he would ride out and drag My Lin back by her hair. News of his threats reached My Lin in town. She returned to the cabin pale and shaken. "He'll come for me," she told Gideon. "He will never stop." Gideon set aside his work, his jaw hard. "Let him come," he said simply. The words carried no boast, only a certainty that made her heart quiver. One night, Lee crept from her pallet to where he sat by the fire. "You won't let him hurt Mama again, will you?" she whispered. Gideon lifted her into his lap, his great hands gentle. "Not while I draw breath," he said. The child pressed her head against his chest and fell asleep there, safe at last. My Lin watched from the bed, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She had once believed all men carried violence in their hands. But here was one who bore shame in silence rather than let it fall on those weaker than him. Hope, however, is a fire that draws shadows. One evening, Gideon returned from town to find a note nailed to his door. The words were crude and angry, "She's mine. Bring her out, or I'll bring men to take her." He tore the note down, crumpling it in his fist. He looked into the cabin where My Lin stirred soup and Lee played with her wooden horse, and felt the line of his life shift. By opening his door, he had declared his side. A reckoning was drawing near, carried on the hooves of a man who would not rest until his pride was fed. The storm announced itself first with a low moan across the prairie. The air turned sharp, and the horizon thickened with a black weight. Gideon worked quickly, securing the barn, his breath fogging in the cold. Inside, My Lin shuttered the windows, her hands trembling but steady. By dusk, the first lash of wind struck, rattling the cabin. Gideon entered, shutting the door hard against the gale. He and My Lin met eyes. He gave a slow nod, an acknowledgement that the storm outside was not the only one they had to face. Word had reached him in town. Clay Garrett, fueled by drink, had sworn he would reclaim his wife, and he was not coming alone. Now, as the storm raged, My Lin asked, "Do you think he will come in this weather?" Gideon looked toward the window, where snow whirled like ghosts. If a man's rage is hot enough, even a blizzard won't cool it. Near midnight, over the howl of wind, came another sound, hoofbeats crunching through snow. "They're here," My Lin whispered, fear cracking her voice. Gideon took up his rifle but set it by the door. He turned to My Lin. "Get her into the back room. Do not open that door unless you hear my voice." She hesitated, then gathered Lee and disappeared into the small room. Fists pounded against the cabin door. "Blackwood!" Clay roared. "You think you can steal what's mine? Bring her out." Gideon said nothing. He lit a lantern, unbarred the door, and stepped out onto the porch. Snow burst inward, but he stood firm, the lantern raised. The men flinched at the light. Clay sat on his horse, his face bloated with fury. "You've shamed me, Blackwood. I'll see you ruined before this night ends." Gideon's voice, low and steady, carried through the gale. "She was never yours to break." The words struck harder than any fist. Clay spurred his horse forward, shouting, "Drag her out." One of his men dismounted, stumbling toward the porch. Gideon met him, his great frame a wall against the storm. The fight was short and brutal. Fists swung, but Gideon moved with the power of a man defending his world. He dropped the first man, then the second, their rage cooled by the unyielding force of his defense. Finally, Clay dismounted, his pride greater than his fear. He lunged, his fist swinging wild. Gideon caught the blow on his arm and countered, sending Clay stumbling back. They grappled in the snow, a chaotic dance in the storm. At last, Gideon caught him by the collar and slammed him against a porch post. The wood shuddered. "Do it," Clay hissed, blood on his lips. "Kill me." That's what they expect from the giant. Gideon's fist hovered, but then he heard a faint sound from the cabin, Ellie's soft cry for her mother. The sound pierced his rage. Justice was not blood upon the snow, it was dignity returned. He lowered his fist, dragged Clay to his horse, and threw him into the saddle. "Tell the sheriff I'll be in at dawn," Gideon said to the other men. And if you return here, you'll find no storm strong enough to hide you. The men spurred their horses, dragging Clay with them into the dark. The hoofbits faded, swallowed by the wind. Gideon stood for a long moment before turning back inside. Warmth met him. My Lin stood near the hearth, her face pale but her eyes fierce. Unli ran forward, pressing her small body against Gideon's leg. "You saved us," she whispered. He bent, lifting her into his arms, and she curled against his chest as if it were the safest place on earth. My Lin watched, a sob of relief threatening to break free. She had only ever survived. Tonight, she glimpsed something more. As the storm softened to a hush, they sat by the fire. Unli had drifted to sleep in Gideon's arms. He did not move her, and the hard lines of his face softened in the firelight. My Lin's heart tightened with a hope that was both brave and terrifying. Hours passed. At last, Gideon laid the sleeping child on her pallet. He stood, facing My Lin across the hearth. No words were spoken, yet in the silence, something shifted. His silence was no longer heavy, but a kind of vow. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "I am not his anymore." Gideon did not need to answer. His presence was answer enough. The storm had passed, but in its wake, something new had taken root. 3 broken lives had begun to knit themselves together. Still, shadows lingered. Justice would demand its price, and tongues would wag sharper than ever. As dawn brushed silver against the snow, Gideon spoke, his voice as low as the earth itself. "This is only the beginning." My Lin met his gaze across the fading firelight. Something unspoken passed between them, fragile as glass, strong as stone. The storm outside had ended, but their reckoning had only just begun.